Let's start working with some of the basic options in ACR. We know what it looks like now. We can drive this thing down the road, I guess. Maybe not too good, but we can drive it. Open up the one we used in the previous lesson, this one right here. Just double click. All right, we got an image open. We're going to look at some basic ways to change it. And I want to show you and bring in something called snapshots too, because they can help you see the history, in a sense, the evolution of what you've done, and maybe decide which way's best. Come over here to this button. If you don't see the basic stuff here, it's because you got one of these buttons over here selected. Go ahead and go, well, to the zoom tool, the hand tool, doesn't matter, and go to basic, the little tab right here, and then move over all the way to the end and go to snapshots. Click the new button down here. Let's call this one original. What is a snapshot? A snapshot is the current state of the image. Anytime you want to, you can have as many of these things as you want. You can come back to that particular snapshot and then work forward from that point. Now, here's the good news. If you save this document and come back to it, the snapshots will still be there. That's not how it works in Photoshop. When we get to history, you're going to see that. We can create snapshots while we're working, but if we close and reopen the file, they'll be gone. So it's nice to know these things are always going to be there for us, and don't forget, everything we do is non-destructive. Let's go back to basic. Now at the top, you have a white balance. White balance is measured in Kelvin, and the common accepted, although you'll get different views on this, the common accepted white point for sunlight at noon is 5500 Kelvin. Now I did this one as shot. My camera does have settings on it. It's got a little picture of a sun or a little picture of a light bulb, and I chose the little picture of the sun, meaning sunlight, and it, Nikon, says 4750. And I'm thinking, well, okay, I understand that, but I would rather have it at 5500. If I come up here, you've got auto, daylight, cloudy, shade, etc. There's fluorescence, flash, even custom. Let's go to daylight. Now you can see Adobe considers daylight 5500. Now if we turn that on and off, we have made our first change, and I don't know, actually I like it. I think I'll leave it there. You can change it manually right here if you want to. You do have a tint down here. Well, if we go this way with it, it warms the image up. If we go this way, it cools it down. I'm keeping my eye on my histogram on the top right. Really tells me what's going on with the image. I think I'll cool it down just a little, something like that. Down here, you have an auto button. I'm not a big fan of auto. I like to do the controlling myself. You might want to click that and see what it does, though. We're not going to. Let's start with exposure. I think of exposure as an intelligent brightness control. If you've ever been in Photoshop and done brightness and contrast, the brightness slider is a linear control. Everything gets lighter and everything gets darker. With exposure, it's different. It works mostly with the midtones like exposure would do and tries to avoid too much correction on either side. So if we go into exposure and see how it slides those middle areas on the histogram, good indication of what's going on. I think I'll put it right about there. Now while we're here though, let's look at how we can control what's going on in any of these. For example, I grabbed that slider and I dragged it left and right, which is about as common as you can get. If I click inside of that box, my cursor is blinking inside there, and I use my up and down arrow keys, I go 10 points at a time for exposure. If I hold the shift key down, I go like 50. My favorite way of doing it, however, is to actually touch anywhere up here above it. You'll see an index finger on your hand go up and a little arrow going left and right, and just drag. Again, I'm watching my histogram up there to make sure I'm not blowing anything out. Now here's a trick. While you're doing exposure and you're dragging back and forth, and you kind of want to make sure you're not going too far either way, hold down the Alt key, that's the Option key on a Mac and the Alt key in Windows, and drag left and right and watch what happens. Those areas are blowing out. You can see it. You let go of the Alt key, you get back to the image. Gives you kind of a quick view. I usually rely a lot on that histogram though. Contrast is exactly what you think it is. It helps to distinguish the items by removing intermediate steps of like shading. It makes areas appear more contrasty. So if we go this way, what we're really doing is removing a lot of the softer steps between each one of the leaves and the water, whatever it is. We go this way, we're increasing them. Now on contrast, I think I'll give it just a little bit. Highlights and shadows basically handle only those areas. Again, watch the histogram. I go to highlights. See how it moves primarily the right-hand side and it doesn't do anything to the left-hand side. Shadows will do the same thing, but on the other side. Lightening or darkening the shadow areas. Now, whites and blacks are compression. Watch the histogram again to see how this works. If I go to whites, watch the right-hand side. See how it pulls the whole thing in and compresses it? Or we go this way and it pulls it out. A little bit more linear than highlights and shadows. Blacks does the same thing. These are my favorites down here, but before we go, we need another snapshot. Let's go here and click New. Let's call this one Phase 1. Click OK. Here's our original. Here's what we have done. Sometimes, I think, in the course of working, we kind of forget what the original really looked like. Sometimes going back to it's kind of a nice way to say, well, yeah, I do like what I've done so far. And don't forget, this is all temporary anyway. Let's go back to basic. The last three, I like working with these. Clarity is an interesting one. If I move it all the way to the left, what it does is it begins to blur the distinction between the elements within the image. If I go the other way, it gets sharper in a sense, but I don't like using the word sharp. It increases the clarity between each one of the objects in the image. But I do like that. Let's make that softer. Let's go for a soft look. Vibrance and saturation. Let's start with saturation. Now I'm going to move saturation all the way to the left, but I want your eyes up here. It will turn it into shades of gray, but watch what happens to the histogram. When you grayscale an image, you're saying to the computer, take the red, green, and blue channels and equalize them. In RGB additive, if you have the same amount of red and green and blue, it produces a shade of gray. So that's why our histogram looks like just one thing. If we go the other way, they begin separating again. What happens when we go all the way? See how it lowers it down? You are purifying the colors. 100% saturation is where the colors are pure colors. Pure red, a pure green, pure blue. Let's take that down. I want a little bit, but not a lot. Somewhere about there. Now, vibrance is somewhat like saturation, except it concentrates more in the middle tones and tries to isolate the shadows and highlights. So if I take vibrance all the way down, as you can see, I still have color, but it's concentrated more in the highlight and shadow areas. And if I go the other way, I get more vibrance in those areas. And maybe take that down just a little bit more. It looks like some really awesome fall day. Let's take another snapshot. And we'll call this one Phase 2. Click OK. Here's our original. Here's Phase 1. And here's Phase 2. At any point in time, what you can do is come back here. You can say, well, I don't like that, but I think I want to start from here. And you could start there, click there, and go right back here again and start working. Or you can say, I'm going to start from the beginning. And that's why I always try to actually have an original when I start, because I think that's a good thing to have. And so you got this. You could have as many of these as you want. Anytime you want to, if we open the image in Photoshop, you can open it from one of these phases. Let's go ahead and do that. Let's say open the image. If we come into our history, you will notice the snapshots are gone. They're only for raw. History does snapshots, but remember in Photoshop, they're not saved with the document. But we have an image. We are ready to go with it and work on it. And notice, even though it says DSC 2429NEF, which is the name of it, if I go up here and try to save it, it will make me give it a new name with a new designation, not raw. No matter what you do, no matter how you handle your images, you still have your original negative. Basics and snapshots in Camera Raw.